This is the first part of medical terminology, explaining nervous system anatomy in detail. First example is encephalo, which means brain. Brain is an organ of soft nervous tissue contained in the skull of vertebrates, functioning as the coordinating center of sensation and intellectual and nervous activity. Second example is myelo, which means spinal cord. Spinal cord is the cylindrical bundle of nerve fibers and associated tissue which is enclosed in the spine and connects nearly all parts of the body to the brain, with which it forms the central nervous system. Third example is cerebello, which means cerebellum, the part of the brain at the back of the skull in vertebrates. Its function is to coordinate and regulate muscular activity. Fourth example is pineal, which means pineal gland, a pea-sized conical mass of tissue behind the third ventricle of the brain, secreting a hormone-like substance in some mammals. Fifth example is Dura, which means Dura Mater, which is the tough fibrous membrane that envelopes the brain and spinal cord external to the arachnoid and pia mater. Sixth example is fronto. Fronto means frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the most anterior, front, part of the brain. Location of frontal lobe. It extends from the area behind the forehead back to the precentral gyrus. Function of the frontal lobe is responsible for higher cognitive functions such as memory, emotions, impulse control, problem solving, social interaction, and motor function. Seventh example is temporo, which means temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is one of the four major lobes of the cerebral cortex. Location: it is the lower lobe of the cortex, sitting close to ear level within the skull. Function: the temporal lobe is largely responsible for creating and preserving both conscious and long-term memory. Eighth example is occipital, which means occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is the visual processing area of the brain. Function: it is associated with visuospatial processing, distance and depth perception, color determination, object and face recognition, and memory formation. Ninth example is parietal, which means parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is one of the major lobes in the brain. Location: located at the upper back area in the skull. Function: it processes sensory information it receives from the outside world, mainly relating to touch, taste, and temperature. 10th example is polio, which means gray matter, the darker tissue of the brain and spinal cord, consisting mainly of nerve cell bodies and branching dendrites. 11th example is leuko, which means white matter, the paler tissue of the brain and spinal cord, consisting mainly of nerve fibers with their myelin sheaths. 12th example is neuro, which means nerve or neuron. Neurons are information messengers. Function: they use electrical impulses and chemical signals to transmit information between different areas of the brain, and between the brain and the rest of the nervous system. 13th example is dendr, which means dendrite, a short-branched extension of a nerve cell, along which impulses received from other cells at synapses are transmitted to the cell body. 14th example is soma, which means body of neuron. The soma, or cell body, is where the signals from the dendrites are joined and passed on. The soma and the nucleus do not play an active role in the transmission of the neural signal. Instead, these two structures serve to maintain the cell and keep the neuron functional. 15th example is plexo, which means nerve plexus. Bundles of nerves that form a plexus communicate information to your brain about pain, temperature, and pressure. 16th example is ganglio, which means ganglion. A ganglion is a cluster of nerve cells found in the peripheral nervous system. The cells that are specific to a ganglion are called ganglion cells. 17th example is myelin. Myelin is an insulating layer, or sheath that forms around nerves, including those in the brain and spinal cord. It is made up of protein and fatty substances. This myelin sheath allows electrical impulses to transmit quickly and efficiently along the nerve cells. 18th example is synapto, which means synapse. Synapse, also called neuronal junction, the site of transmission of electric nerve impulses between two nerve cells. Neurons are between a neuron and a gland or muscle cell. Effector, a synaptic connection between a neuron and a muscle cell is called a neuromuscular junction. 19 example is GLIAL, which means glial cells, any of the cells that hold nerve cells in place and help them work the way they should. The types of glial cells include oligodendrocytes, astrocytes, microglia, and ependymal cells. 20 example is Schwann, which means Schwann cells, a type of glial cell of the peripheral nervous system that helps separate and insulate nerve cells. Learn terminologies with MJM.